There are people in Hollywood who make the job easy. And then there are people who make you question whether the job is even worth it. Ernest Borgnine worked with some of the biggest names in the business. He fought beside legends. He laughed with icons. He shook hands with Oscar winners and sat at the same table as the most powerful people in the room. But there was one person, just one, that he could never fully forgive. One person whose name still made his jaw tighten decades after the cameras stopped rolling. And the story of what happened between them is far more shocking than anything you have ever seen on a movie screen. We are going to take you inside the moment that changed everything. But first, you need to understand exactly who Ernest Borgnine was, because this man's life story is unlike anything Hollywood has ever produced. He was not supposed to be a star. Not even close. He was born Ernest Borgnine in 1917 in Hamden, Connecticut, the son of Italian immigrants who came to America chasing a dream. When he was just 2 years old, his parents separated and his mother took him back to Italy. He spent 5 years there in a small town near Modena, speaking only Italian, playing in the streets, not knowing a single word of English. Then in 1923 his parents got back together and the family returned to the United States. His father changed the family name, shortened it to Borgnine, made it sound more American. For little Ernest, that name change was just the beginning of a long journey of figuring out who he really was. Growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, he had zero interest in acting. None. He was a sports kid. Physical, competitive, rough around the edges. Nobody who looked at him in high school would have said that boy is going to win an Oscar one day. There was nothing in him that pointed toward Hollywood. What pointed him somewhere else was the United States Navy. In 1935, right out of high school, he enlisted. He served for 6 years on the USS Lamberton, a destroyer, and was ready to move on by 1941. He got his honorable discharge. And then Pearl Harbor happened. 2 months after he left the Navy, Japan attacked and everything changed. He could not sit still while his country was at war. He went right back and re-enlisted in January 1942, this time serving on the USS Sill, a patrol yacht defending the Atlantic coast. The war did something to him. It hardened him, gave him discipline, and taught him what real loyalty between people actually looks like. By 1945, he had risen to the rank of gunner's mate first class and earned multiple military honors. He almost stayed in the Navy forever. He seriously thought about re-enlisting for another 10 years. And if he had done that, Hollywood would have never heard the name Ernest Borgnine. But his mother said something that stuck. She told him he had a forceful personality, and that he should try acting. Just like that, one sentence from his mother, and his whole life shifted. He enrolled at the Randall School of Drama in Hartford, and then made his way to Virginia, where he joined the Barter Theater. Now this was not a glamorous situation. The Barter Theater had been founded during the Great Depression with a wild idea that people could trade food for tickets. That meant the actors were sometimes paid in vegetables instead of money. Borgnine did not care. He painted sets, fixed costumes, scrubbed toilets, and chased a live chicken across the stage one night when it escaped into the audience. The whole place went into chaos, people screaming and laughing, and he learned something important in that moment. He learned how to take a disaster and turn it into entertainment. That skill would follow him for the rest of his career. By 1949, he made it to Broadway, landing a role in Harvey alongside the great James Stewart. Casting directors did not know what to do with his face. Too mean for comedy, too funny for drama. But Stewart saw something in him, and Borgnine kept a notebook, writing down every little observation he made while watching Stewart work. He studied that man like a student studying for the most important exam of his life. That kind of dedication was just who Ernest Borgnine was. Then television came calling in 1951, and a small film role in From Here to Eternity in 1953 changed the way people saw him. He played Sergeant Fatso Judson, a cruel and sadistic man who beats Frank Sinatra's character to death with a nightstick. Sinatra himself doubted whether Borgnine could pull it off. But once filming started, that doubt vanished completely. Borgnine isolated himself for days to get into character, and when the cameras rolled, he became someone else entirely. The performance was so real that crew members avoided him on set. People sent him death threats because they could not separate the actor from the monster he was playing. That role made him a somebody. But the role that made him a legend came in 1955. Marty. A tiny film made on a budget of just $343,000 about an ordinary butcher from the Bronx looking for love. It was the complete opposite of Sergeant Fatso Judson. Director Delbert Mann had not even considered Borgnine for the part at first. He wanted Rod Steiger, who had already played Marty in a TV version. But then Borgnine showed up at a Hollywood party, charmed the producers, and they gave him a screen test. His performance was so natural, so real, so completely effortless that Mann later said Ernest Borgnine did not act Marty, he was Marty. At the 1955 Academy Awards, Borgnine won Best Actor. He was 38 years old. He beat out legends like James Dean and Spencer Tracy. And when he stood up there to accept that award, all he did was thank his mother, the woman who told him to try acting in the first place. Now here is where the story gets interesting. Because not long before that Oscar win, something happened on a movie set that Borgnine would never fully shake. It was during the filming of Bad Day at Black Rock in 1954, and it involved the man he had just beaten for that Academy Award, Spencer Tracy. Now you have to understand something. Tracy was already considered one of the greatest actors who ever lived. Two-time Academy Award winner. Known for making everything look completely natural. Borgnine, at 37, was still fighting to prove himself. The gap in experience between these two men hung over every single scene they shared together. Tracy had a habit that threw his co-stars off completely. He would change lines, improvise mid-scene, deliver something so unexpectedly that the person opposite him would freeze. One day during a tense scene he threw in a line that nobody had heard before. Borgnine froze completely, did not move. And that exact frozen moment made it into the final cut of the film because the director loved how real it looked. Borgnine later admitted that working beside Spencer Tracy was the most intimidated he had ever felt in his entire career. There was one day in August during an important scene where Borgnine messed up his lines 7 times in a row. 7 times. And with each mistake he could feel Tracy's frustration growing. The tension between them started bleeding into their performances in ways that actually made the movie better. The fight scene filmed on August 23rd was the moment everything came to a head. Tracy played a one-armed war veteran who had to take down Borgnine's character using pure skill. In real life, Borgnine was bigger, heavier, much more physically imposing. But none of that mattered. They needed 14 takes to get the scene right. By the 7th take things got a little too real when Borgnine accidentally landed a hard punch on Tracy's jaw. The entire set went silent. Tracy paused, shrugged it off like nothing had happened. And Borgnine, already nervous, felt even worse about it. Then Tracy stared him down and delivered a line that felt personal, like he was not talking to the character at all, but to Borgnine himself. That moment stayed with Borgnine for the rest of his life. But something surprising happened after all of that. Tracy, who had spent most of the shoot keeping Borgnine completely on edge, suddenly had a new kind of respect for the man. Because Borgnine had taken every uncomfortable moment, every intimidating look, every line change thrown at him. And he had not quit. He had pushed through. And not long after filming wrapped, Spencer Tracy recommended Borgnine for Marty, the very role that would win him an Oscar. So in a strange way, the man who made his life hardest on set also handed him the biggest gift of his career. That is the kind of complicated, layered relationship that Hollywood rarely talks about. But if Spencer Tracy was the man who challenged him, there was someone else entirely who represented something darker. Someone whose behavior crossed a line that Borgnine could never quite excuse. Someone whose actions left a mark not just on him, but on the people around them. And that person was Joan Crawford. In 1954, Borgnine signed on to Johnny Guitar expecting a regular film shoot. What he found instead was a battlefield. Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge were both in the film, and from the moment the cameras started rolling it was clear that these two women absolutely could not stand each other. The reason went back to something personal. Crawford had discovered that McCambridge's husband had once been involved with her. That piece of history was all Crawford needed. She made it her mission to make McCambridge's life on that set as miserable as possible. Borgnine watched things unfold with his own eyes. One day Crawford stormed onto the set, grabbed McCambridge's costumes right off the rack, and threw them onto the highway outside. The entire crew had to rush out and gather them from the road before they were gone for good. Crawford and McCambridge refused to even be in the same room together, which forced director Nicholas Ray to film their scenes completely separately and stitch everything together in editing. The whole production was being held hostage by the feud between these two women. And on September 3rd, things went from bad to completely out of control. During a particularly explosive moment, the two of them lost all control. They went from shouting to swinging. Borgnine and co-star Sterling Hayden had to physically jump in and separate them. He later called it the most unprofessional thing he had ever witnessed in his entire career in Hollywood. And that is saying something, because Ernest Borgnine had seen a lot. Now here is the part that matters. Crawford never turned her fury on Borgnine. The two of them actually got along just fine on a personal level. He found her charming when she wanted to be. But he also watched her, really watched her, and what he saw was a woman who could explode without any warning and without any remorse. There was the day he accidentally walked into a room where she was screaming at a costume designer. Her voice was sharp and her eyes were wild, and Borgnine did not say a single word. He just backed quietly out of the room before she could turn and notice him standing there. Because he already knew. You did not want to be the next target. What made it worse was that Crawford had a way of acting like nothing had happened. One minute she was throwing things and screaming and making people miserable. The next minute she was smiling, calm, handing out gifts and acting like the most gracious woman in the room. Borgnine watched this pattern repeat itself over and over during the shoot. It unsettled him more than the outbursts themselves. At least when someone was openly angry, you knew where you stood. What Crawford did was different. She could switch it off like flipping a light switch. And that kind of unpredictability, to a man who had spent years in the Navy where trust and consistency could mean the difference between life and death, felt deeply wrong. It felt dishonest in a way that went beyond the normal difficult behavior he had come across on other sets. He started paying close attention to how she treated the people below her, the assistants, the wardrobe staff, the young runners who had no power and no voice. And what he noticed bothered him deeply. Crawford was perfectly pleasant to directors, producers, and co-stars when it suited her. But the moment someone could not fight back, the mask slipped. She spoke to them like they were invisible. She snapped at them for things that were not their fault. And more than once Borgnine saw junior crew members walk away from an interaction with her visibly shaken, trying to hold it together in front of everyone else on set. But the moment that Borgnine could never fully let go of, the moment that stuck in his mind for decades, happened when Crawford grabbed a cup of hot coffee and threw it at a young production assistant. Not at a co-star. Not at someone with any power in that room. At a kid who was just trying to do his job. That young person suffered second-degree burns. Real burns. Real pain. Real consequences from one completely unchecked moment of rage. Borgnine was standing close enough to see it happen. Close enough to see the expression on that young person's face. And something in him went cold. He could forgive a lot of things. He had been in the Navy. He had played brutal characters on screen. He had been on the receiving end of Spencer Tracy's intimidation tactics. He understood that strong personalities sometimes clash and sometimes people say things in the heat of the moment that they do not mean. But what Crawford did to that production assistant was different. That was not passion. That was not creative tension. That was cruelty aimed at someone who had no power to fight back. And Borgnine believed with everything in him that a person's true character shows up in how they treat the people who cannot do anything to them in return. Years after the filming of Johnny Guitar Wrapped, he gave interviews where he talked carefully about Joan Crawford. He never tried to destroy her publicly. He was never the kind of man who kicked someone while they were down. But when the subject of that day on set came up, something in his tone always changed. There was a weight to his words, a careful kind of distance. He described her as brilliant, because she genuinely was. He described her as like walking on eggshells while juggling dynamite. He said she was like a ticking time bomb, and you never knew what was going to set her off. But behind all of those careful, measured words was something deeper. It was the image of a young person holding a burned hand, and a woman who did not even pause to look back. People who knew Borgnine personally said that he rarely brought up Joan Crawford in private conversation. He did not enjoy talking about her. It was not anger exactly, it was more like a quiet kind of disappointment. Because the truth was, he had gone into that set genuinely admiring her. Joan Crawford was a Hollywood icon. She had earned her status through decades of hard work and real talent. Borgnine respected that. He respected people who had put in the time and the effort and built something real with their careers. But what he saw on that set forced him to separate the actress from the person. And once he made that separation, it never closed back up. He could watch her work and acknowledge the talent. He just could not forgive the person behind it. That image never left Ernest Borgnine. Not after all the Oscars. Not after all the great films. Not after Hale's Navy made him a household name, or SpongeBob SquarePants introduced him to an entirely new generation of fans. Not even at 95 years old, when he was still working, still recording, still showing up. He carried it with him. Because that is the thing about moments that reveal someone's true character. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And a man like Borgnine, who built his entire life on discipline and loyalty and a deep respect for the people around him, could not simply move past what he saw on that set. On July 8, 2012, Ernest Borgnine passed away at 95 years old with his wife Tova beside him, holding his hand. He had spent 5 decades in Hollywood. He had survived impossible odds, 5 marriages, Navy deployments, bomb explosions on set, helicopter crashes, death threats from fans, and the full chaos of one of the most volatile film sets in Hollywood history. He came out the other side of all of it still standing, still working, still grateful. The coffee, the burns, the young person who never asked for any of it. That was the one thing he never quite left behind. And now you know why.